All right, this is Russell Canning, and this time I have Jason Sorens on the line.
It's great to be here, Russell. Thanks for having me.
Yes, we finally got to hook this up, and this will be fun.
Yeah, I'm
Everybody we
looking forward to
talk,
it.
everybody we talk to about NHExit has different viewpoints and stuff like this, and this has kind of been a big deal for you for a while, hasn't it? When was the
Yeah,
first time you were interested in secession?
I was probably in high school the first time I got interested in the idea, but I've been researching it since graduate school and wrote a book about it, about secessionist movements around the world. So I find it to be an interesting phenomenon, the idea of um, gaining sovereignty for a new state, withdrawing from an existing state, and uh, and seeking recognition from the international community. All those aspects are pretty intriguing. You can think of secession as the logical endpoint, the extreme of decentralization. So you can get more and more autonomy for a particular people or a particular region, and in the limit, when you have all the autonomy, you're independent.
Yes. So when did you? So you were already finished your undergrad, and then you came across a book or a series of books that really intrigued you.
Yeah, so I guess I got interested in secession through libertarian philosophy and the idea of smaller government, and we often think that um, we have more freedom when government is closer to home.
Hmm.
So we tend to think that maybe local governments are going to be less oppressive than state governments, which will be less oppressive than national governments, which will be less oppressive than a world government. And that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes local governments can do quite bad things, and sometimes you can have a lot of oppression at the local level. Um, but the so long as people are able to choose freely where they live, um, and they have a large amount of choice over that, and um, there's some freedom of exit um, for towns or regions from the larger entities that they inhabit. Um, I think that's a situation where individuals ultimately enjoy a lot of freedom. You can think of government as a kind of customer service agency.
Hmm.
If it's easy for us to shed one government and get a new one, then maybe that makes government a lot more accountable, and government becomes our servant rather than our master.
Well, haven't we seen that to be true when people have choices?
I think so, and we see that in the marketplace, right? When you can easily shift from one product to another, they have to compete for you, and they really try very hard to serve you and to come up with new products and services that are going to get your dollar. And it's harder when it comes to government, because government, we're used to thinking of government as being a territorial monopoly, right? So there's only one government in the place where you live. But in fact, in a federal system, there are many governments that overlap. And you can imagine having the freedom to choose which of those higher level governments you're a part of, or maybe get out of from under the reach of all of them. And there are some advantages and disadvantages to that, but that choice is still possible, and maybe we can get a reasonable facsimile of that kind of freedom that we have in the marketplace or in our friendships and our normal social interactions.
Yeah. So has your thinking about this changed over time, or is it just kind of built?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of complexities to this issue. So um, defending the right of secession doesn't always mean that you favor actually seceding under all circumstances. And there can be secessions that are unwise or have bad consequences. Think about the US Civil War or South Sudan gaining independence from Sudan. It's probably good that that war ended and Sudan let South Sudan go, but South Sudan has been a basket case since then. So secession isn't necessarily a solution, but if we have a system in which um, secession is allowed, that's going to be one in which higher level governments have to pay attention to the interests of the people who control lower level governments. And if we, the people, have stronger control over our own local governments and our own state governments, then having a right of secession can really help us get what we want from these distant governments that are otherwise not very accountable.
Hmm. What over the last, say, 10, 20 years, what have been the most interesting cases that have happened that you've tracked, or countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting cases out there because we haven't seen in a developed country, we haven't seen an actual secession for a long time. The last real secession in a sort of developed democratic society was Iceland, which gained independence from Denmark in 1918 and then became a republic in 1944. So also withdrew
Hmm.
from the Danish monarchy, and that was peaceful and happened through a referendum. But since that time, we haven't seen any. But there have been many that have come close, and so the Scottish case is interesting. And Scotland, I think, is a case where you asked where I've changed my mind, and that might be a case where initially I was pretty sympathetic to Scottish independence as an actual reality. I still think that Britain has um, been a model in the way it's treated Scotland and allowing them to have a vote and committing to respecting the results of that. But I no longer think that Scottish independence would be desirable because I think the British government has been a pretty tolerant one, and the Scottish government is in many ways less free than the British government, and that's become increasingly obvious since devolution. And so I think, if I were there, I'd probably vote against it as a libertarian who favors
Yeah,
individual
you're right.
freedom.
When
Yeah,
you were talking about places where you wouldn't want it to happen, I was picturing myself that if I lived in Scotland, and as Brexit kept going, if they were to split off and rejoin the EU entanglements in many ways, yeah, I'd
hmm,
actually be wanting to move into England.
right.
I could picture that. So yeah, when you think
Yeah,
about it, if you were in Scotland and there was a referendum, you would, if you were there right now, you wouldn't be voting for it.
that's right. But I think
Yeah,
they should
interesting.
have the freedom to have those referendums. So it's a nuanced
Hmm.
position.
Yeah. Well,
um,
that's the other thing, is whether we're allowed to even talk about it, or have
right.
referendums. Yeah.
Well, that's right, and that's an open question in the United States, and unfortunately, I think there's a large body of opinion in the U.S. that says that states don't have the right to secede, and that it's somehow illegal and should be crushed with force, which I think is a mistake on several levels. First of all, violence is always, violence against peaceful people is always regrettable, and that's what crushing secession would in practice mean. Um, but it's also regrettable because it's clogged our thinking, and we're just unable to think of alternatives. Do we really think that the U.S. government is the best way to arrange things from here to eternity? That seems doubtful. I mean, we've seen how the U.S. government has massively failed us during the pandemic when it comes to testing and vaccines, and the stories just come out every day about how the federal government's standing in the way of the private sector solving this thing. So, would it be would we have a better policy if New Hampshire, for instance, were independent? I think we would. There'd be some disadvantages to that as well. So I'm not saying um, I think New Hampshire should become independent tomorrow, if there were a referendum. But I think we need to be able to think those thoughts and have a reasoned discussion about them rather than letting our minds be fogged by nationalism.
And if a smaller group like a state, they could always join larger groups on an issue by issue basis, or problem by problem, right?
Well, that's what
I think.
independent governments do now. I mean,
Yeah,
no country in the world is completely isolated, right? You can form trade agreements, you can join military alliances, you can join organizations that coordinate things like telephone gauges and billing and, and things like that.
yeah,
I mean,
and you're
there
just like you're talking about health. I mean, you can
right.
join with you could there could be big regional health things or world health things. You could you can join
Yeah,
those things.
absolutely. Yeah, you could have cooperation, and as a as a libertarian, in that sense, I am all for globalization, which is cooperation of individuals across borders and firms and companies and organizations. But also, I think there are times when governments need to cooperate with each other to help just solve problems that cross borders, pollution, things like that. And
Hmm.
that's not a that's only a threat to our freedom if we don't trust those governments, if we don't trust our government to do the right thing. And a lot of the time, I don't trust the U.S. government to do the right thing. But I think the state of New Hampshire would do the right thing more often than not.
I also have, in my mind, a lot of the decentralization. Sometimes you think of your local politicians as being really criminal. I think it's because you know more stuff on a local level. We don't even know what's going on at the federal level. You don't even know what's going on back behind closed doors. It's too big, too hidden. Uh,
Yeah,
as a
that's
side
true. And
thing,
and I think a lot of the places that are when you think about local governments that are corrupt, they tend to be the really large cities. I mean,
well,
Chicago, for
yeah,
instance, is a city of what 3 million people. So that's bigger than some countries.
and
So
and and the bigger that it attracts the worst criminals because there's a bigger pie
Mhm.
to steal. I think
Yeah.
bigger thing.
And
Uh,
I think there are some things we need to solve with local government. I think people don't participate enough in local government here in New Hampshire, for instance. Participation is pretty high compared to the rest of the country, but still much lower than it is for state and federal elections. And I think that allows local government to get away with things with zoning and property taxes and spending that state government doesn't often get away with.
and that you might not even know about. There's no media coverage, or
Right. Yeah. So
you might
there
not.
are some things we need to fix, but at least the possibility is there. And people in New Hampshire do care a lot about choice of local government. They talk a lot about which towns have high and low tax rates and things like that, and that tells you something that that's worth building on.
Now, kind of as a side thing, I was going to ask you some of your experiences with attitudes towards secession and stuff. Now, you've have you always lived in the U.S.,
I have.
but you've lived in several different states, right?
That's right. I've lived in Oklahoma, Virginia, Texas, North Carolina, New York, Connecticut, and New Hampshire.
So, what have you found amongst different states, their attitudes?
Towards secession.
Yeah,
Well, in Texas, the idea was, well, we could secede if we wanted to.
yeah,
That that we could be successful as an independent country. Texas was independent for 9 years, and Texans are very proud of that. So I think that's maybe the state where secessionist sentiment tends to be highest, with the possible exception of Alaska, which has an actual political party devoted to
yeah.
independence.
But but it wasn't nearly that much in Oklahoma, right?
Well, I mean, I lived in Oklahoma when I was 1 and 2 years old.
Oh,
So,
okay. And then so when you were in Virginia, that wouldn't
right.
have the same kind of thing either, would it?
No, and I think anytime you're in the old Confederacy, there is this tendency to associate secession with the South shall rise again types
Yeah.
of tropes, and and you have the League of the South and these groups that really want the South to secede for kind of reactionary. Um, almost racialist reasons,
Mhm.
So I don't have much sympathy with that, and I think actually most people in the South don't, and it's kind of tainted the whole issue.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and so I don't think of those states as being fertile ground for a kind of authentic independence movement that's free of all the baggage.
Yeah, I almost can't picture any of the southern states except for Texas. I mean, it would have
Right.
to be Texas first because yeah, I can't really picture. It'd almost have to be called something besides secession. It would have to be like a whole different thing, wouldn't it? To
Yeah. And I mean, this could. I have an essay in Modern Age recently. I reviewed this book by law professor Frank Buckley on American secession, and in that I say that one of the ways secession could happen is sort of just gradually, right? And so
Mhm.
it wouldn't go by that name, but it just could be that states gain more and more autonomy, maybe de facto, if the federal government becomes more and more dysfunctional and unable to enforce its laws, as has been the case with marijuana, for example. States gradually go their own way, and maybe you don't call it independence, but that's effectively what it becomes.
Yeah,
So yeah.
interesting. Did you find anything else in his book particularly interesting for us?
Yeah, it's an interesting book. I mean, he goes through the constitutional law of secession and makes a good case that first of all, um, U.S. versus white or Texas versus white was wrongly decided, which is this 1869 case that said that secession is illegal without the consent of the other states. And it relied on the Articles of Confederation actually to make that claim because you
That's
can't find that
interesting.
in the U.S. Constitution. But there is a clause in the Articles of Confederation that says the Union shall be perpetual. Um, and,
Well, if it's going to be perpetual, then nobody could ever decide to leave, even if everybody decided.
yeah, exactly. So it's
How does
not
that work?
right.
And then,
And the Articles of Confederation are not good law anyway. So
yeah, interesting.
so it
No,
is
no,
curious.
yeah. So I pulled up that this article. I can't believe when I looked up his book that I didn't see your review of it. Man, I guess I didn't dig deep enough.
Oh, that's perfectly all right. I mean,
So
I'm not.
I'll link this to this podcast that way people can find it. Yeah, that's cool. Um, One of the things for me is, when this idea that certain states you can't vote yourself out, it,
Mhm.
wasn't it true that every time one of these states joined after the first 13, it was a struggle, right? They took a lot of time deciding. There was people for and against it. And then every time they joined, they always were leaving them. Okay, we could leave if we need to,
Mhm.
right? I
Yeah,
can't.
that was often the case explicitly. I mean, you're of course familiar with New Hampshire's constitution, which says that the state of New Hampshire is by right a sovereign, free, and independent state, and no powers. Something about how powers not expressly delegated to the U.S. Congress are retained by the state. So
Yeah,
you can't get a clearer statement that the state of New Hampshire viewed itself as giving voluntarily these powers to Congress under the knowledge that they could reassume them at any time because they were the sovereign entity and Congress could only gain whatever the states voluntarily gave it.
I know.
Um,
In other states that I've lived in, I mean, California that has similar language. When I was in Wyoming, they think of themselves as, we could leave anytime we want to, this was only temporary if necessary, you know what I mean? But then you watch some things. I was just watching a history documentary the other day and they acted like, oh, California got enough people so they could join. Like this was an automatic thing. Once you got up to enough people, now you're a state. That's not how it works
right.
at all.
Well, yeah, Arizona took so long in part because there were worries that if Arizona became a state, maybe it'd actually have a Native American majority. And, back
Oh
then
yeah,
that was viewed
interesting.
as as a bad thing. So yeah, so these are definitely not automatic. There's a politics of that. Now, I will say Wyoming is one of those states, post Civil War states, whose state constitutions expressly forbid secession.
Yeah, is that
Um,
interesting?
yeah, and some of those clauses are claimed to be unamendable.
Yeah, yeah, see,
So,
that's interesting. So things really changed. Yeah, how many states came in after the Civil War? Maybe 5 or 6, or I don't really
um,
know.
it's definitely more than that. I
Okay.
want to say like yeah, 12 to 15 in
Yeah,
total
because 'cause you're
probably
right. I mean,
graduated after this.
yeah, because maybe California was, but yeah, maybe not Oregon, Washington, Utah, Idaho, all those places.
Yeah, Montana. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Hadn't even thought about that. My history teachers from Montana and Utah are gonna be on me
Right.
because I don't remember when they joined. But
Yeah.
it is funny how it, and then how, part of our thing is how do we get people's in their mind to not think that way, that this isn't even a possibility.
Hmm.
That's the big thing, I think.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's difficult. You'd have to. I think ordinary voters take their cues from leaders in this society. So if
Hmm.
leadership starts talking about it, then voters will start taking it seriously. Um, and there have been polls of support for secession in the United States, and typically, state support for secession ranges from a low of 10% in some states to a high of about 35%. So these are not trivial figures. After all, support for Scottish independence, about 25 years ago was around 25-30%. So, so
Yeah.
you never know. I mean, you need leadership and organizational vehicles to drive that conversation, but things could turn around at any time. And as I mentioned before, you don't even necessarily need to have people talking about it for it to gradually happen anyway, without anyone necessarily noticing you know that that something fundamental has changed.
Hmm.
It could simply be the case that the federal government is enforcing its laws less and less, and what states do matters more and more.
Yeah. Uh, are there other groups in New Hampshire that are focused on uh, New Hampshire independence or secession or decentralization that I might not know about?
Yeah, so
I
there's NHExit, of course, but the only other one that I know of that I'm sure you've heard about as well is the Foundation for New Hampshire Independence,
Yeah.
um, and Carla Garrick runs that. Um,
Yeah, I'm hoping to eventually have all of them on mine on my podcast.
okay,
uh,
great.
yeah,
Yeah,
so yeah,
so there aren't any other or well, wasn't there a New Hampshire Liberty Party? Didn't Ian Freeman start a New Hampshire Liberty Party
I
that was
yes,
national?
they started a thing called the New Hampshire Liberty Party, and then a few years ago, the New Hampshire Libertarian Party (LP) or LP of New
Hmm.
Hampshire. I forget which way it goes. The LP in New Hampshire uh, uh, took put on in its platform like basically everything they wanted.
Okay,
So then they just supported them.
I see.
That's what
Okay.
I looked up their website, and that's what how that ended. That some of the people that were in that, they might even be in charge of the LP in New Hampshire now, and so that they just folded that other one.
So does the
But
New Hampshire Libertarian Party support independence?
I think it does, the one in New
Oh
Hampshire.
wow. Yeah.
I can look
Wow.
that up again, but I think that's part of their platform. I
Wow.
think I looked that up
That's
recently. I'll
something.
I'll post that again on social media because I found that recently where I was looking that up and asking people what they thought of it and stuff like that. Um,
Yeah.
yes, it's not because it's not the same um, as the national LP platform. It's
Right.
stronger.
Yeah. Interesting.
I don't know what the one for the national LP one is. I think the national LP one isn't expressly against it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Whereas the LPNH, I'm looking at their website right now. Yeah, so I'll look that up again to see because it's got a section on that, and I'll post that again for everybody. But yeah, that's the only ones that I know of, and I'm in as doing since I've been cranking up NHExit as my thing. Uh, uh, the One of the things I'm doing is promoting the Foundation for New Hampshire Independence, and handing out their literature and stuff like that. So I'm calling them the think tank uh, arm of our stuff, and I told them that I'll support them until they move their headquarters to Washington D.C.
All right.
When they do that, then I figure they've sold out. So then I have to find somebody else to support.
Yeah,
Groups get
exactly.
sucked into what? That's part of the problem is groups get sucked into Washington D.C. and then you've lost them, or
Well,
it's
that's
hard
right.
to
And
say.
they may have the same values, but you know that they're just going to be beating their heads against the wall of national politics, and it's worthless to support
Well,
that.
you can talk yourself into it. You could even be a New Hampshire Independence Party, but then you can say, "Well, I need to be down in Washington to get at the heart of it, and this is where we need to." You talk yourself into it, and
Yeah.
uh, so yeah, I didn't know if you knew somebody that I didn't know, and then we're also going to try to connect with all the different groups, and I'm hoping starting with you, that I'll slowly go through and try to contact some more academic people to get their opinions. Even people that don't know the specifics of New Hampshire, and that way we can just talk about the things that in general and stuff like that. So if you think of anybody we should talk to next,
Yeah. Well, you should
I'll
talk to Frank Buckley.
yes, okay, we could. Yeah, maybe we should get him on. And
I think he'd be happy to do that. He doesn't really care what anyone thinks about him, so he's
that helps.
he's he'll say whatever he wants,
I've
and he'll
noticed
talk
he's
to whoever
very
he
yeah, he
wants.
is outspoken on Twitter and stuff. It seems like.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that helps. I'm also wanting to get people on here. Like I talked to a Dan Richard guy from New Hampshire, and
Okay.
he doesn't think we should secede. So I want to
Hmm.
talk to people like that too to find
Yeah,
out why do you think we shouldn't,
yeah.
and that sort of thing, because that'll be. Um, so, what do you think of the current status of things with states and stuff with secession?
Um, well, I think national politics is, we're in this moment where um, the national government is becoming um, more in a sense chaotic. It's not giving up power. It's trying to assume more power, but it can't effectively enforce it because especially in the Trump years, it's starting to go to war against itself.
Hmm.
And you're seeing career bureaucrats fighting against the political officials. You're seeing different arms of the federal government working at cross purposes to each other. You're seeing politicians promising things that they simply cannot do, and as a result of that, you know, they they try to square the circle, and that further kind of undermines the capacity of the federal government.
Do you think
And
that's just from the size and like the spending? As the spending compared to the GDP is just keeps growing and growing. Is it
it
just
does, but what the
size?
government is spending on is the government is simply sending checks to people at this point. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the vast
that's
majority
a
of what
new
the government
turn.
does. Yeah, it doesn't, the government isn't, it has a lot of regulations on the books, but it's not spending a lot of resources on actually going around and enforcing laws. We don't have a big federal police force, fortunately. We don't. Even things we've seen like the SEC, things that were feared at one time, they're always a step behind. It seems like the people they're supposed to be regulating. Um,
Yeah, that's been
And
really true since like 2007, 8, huh?
yeah, I think part of it is actually indirectly a result of the size, right? It's a huge organization that's trying to do way too much. It moves slowly. It's not very adaptive. I mean, I just renewed uh, my passport, and we're using 1980s technology to do that, and it takes months to get your passport in the
And I
mail.
think I think that used to happen faster before the Real ID stuff.
Maybe
I
it's
think it used to only take a month or 2.
yeah, no, it's the one organization where we simply don't expect customer service, right? We expect to be, you know, seriously inconvenienced, for
For
no
me,
good reason.
for one of the big jokes for me is you watch a Hollywood blockbuster movie showing people in a control room able to change traffic signals in European cities. But yet, the way you fill out a passport is by taking a photo of yourself and cutting it into a tiny box.
Yeah.
And they're acting like they're controlling the world from space. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, it's crazy, and, yeah, I think a lot of the populism we're seeing on both the left wing and the right wing nowadays is due to people not having their expectations met by government. They're frustrated that it isn't working, and of course, both left wing and right wing think the answer is to give the government more power, whether it's over immigration or over the economy. But it's not that's not going to work. It's going to make the problem worse. So
Yeah.
I think the right now the ideology is not in favor of decentralization, right? So the right wing is very nationalistic right now, and the left wing
Mhm.
has always been nationalistic, even though they wouldn't admit it. Um, and as a result of that,
Yeah.
the ideology is not there, but the practice, I think, is going to be there because the federal government simply can't do what it claims to be able to do.
Yeah, and maybe people will be realizing that. I've been kind of happy with seeing how some of the secession people on the West Coast are still
Mm.
pushing it because they're
Yeah,
feeling like Biden and the Democratic Party are not giving them what they want. But do
right.
you think overall those kinds of people, progressives, or they want certain things done and they want the federal government to do it?
Yeah, so it's interesting, the California National Party and groups like that. I mean, they're still a bit of a fringe, very much so in the political system there. I'm not sure that they even ran candidates in the last election, but yeah, they are all in on the idea that the federal government's irredeemable from their progressive perspective, and they're
Yeah,
probably right. I mean,
yeah. Well,
they're
because
probably
yeah, yeah, because they can lose elections, they can have right wingers go in there, so then that's a big frustration. Yeah,
That's right. And yeah, and the federal government is um, never going to be an instrument of social justice. It just isn't. Like you can try to you can try to make it give lip service to that, but ultimately, um, when you organize violence on that scale, it's going to be the weakest who get hurt by that. Um,
yeah, yeah, because they're
and
the ones that have the least connections to the system.
right,
They're always going to feel left out and stuff like that. So yeah, it is interesting because it seems like the government is getting more dysfunctional, but more people are wanting to keep uh, you know jobs on it, right? Yeah, they're supposed to fix all these things, but they're not fixing anything, and like you're saying, they move so slowly. It'll take them 50 years to leave Afghanistan.
right.
I mean, at this rate, it'll be
Yeah,
when would this
it's
ever happen?
Yeah, it's disturbing. I mean, I see things that remind me of developing countries I've studied, right? Where you get this cycle of um, ideological extremism, disappointment, uh, corruption, and, and mistrust that feeds again into that ideological extremism,
Yeah,
right? And so you get these societies where trust in government is super low, but everyone wants government to do everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a contradiction, but it's part of that. It grows out of that cycle.
Yeah, that's disturbing.
Yeah.
Uh, and also, like when I listen to financial podcasts and stuff, they talk about all the time how Southeast Asia just laughs at us. They think of us as
Yeah.
so slow. They laugh at how long it takes for us to decide to let a building be built, and
Right.
they just think they're leaving us in the dust. Like we feel like we're leaving Europe in the dust, right, for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. We've become a stagnant, complacent society, and I think shaking things up institutionally is exactly the right medicine for us at this point in history.
I know. I was one thing that hit me in the last month was how people in Europe were looking at New York City, say in the '60s, and how
Yeah.
progressive and how vibrant it was. And now, I mean, New York City compared to places in Southeast Asia, I mean,
Right.
there's nothing happening,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, it's interesting. Well, and some people that say that we can't make our own government in New Hampshire, well, we can send out $2,000 checks. How
Right.
hard? I mean, if you're not going to actually do anything, you're just going to tax people and then hand it out. Well, anybody could do that. I could
Yeah.
form that. I could figure
Yeah.
that out in
That's
a
easy
weekend.
stuff.
We could just
That's right.
you fill out an application, I give you money. Okay, we can have 10 people doing that in Concord.
Yeah. And I do have a little bit of faith that, that the voters in New Hampshire are a little bit savvier. And I think we saw that at the last election where there was clearly a segment of voters that wanted to get rid of Trump, but reward the sensible Republicans.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because the New Hampshire swung big time against Trump, but in favor of Republicans at the state level.
Yeah,
Um,
that is kind of curious, isn't it?
it's the only state where that happened. And I think the implication is that there's a segment of voters, the decisive segment of voters, wanted um, you know normal governance, right?
Hmm.
Just like competent governance, and they saw that in Republicans at the state level and maybe Democrats at the federal level.
Yeah. Well, also, especially if you're a person that thinks the government needs to accomplish certain things, didn't Trump seem like kind of he's kind of arbitrary? It's just like things would change all the time and you wouldn't feel like you're making progress.
Yeah, he accomplished very little, even on his own terms, right? The things he said he
Yeah.
would do, building the wall and banning Muslims and things like that, he didn't really do, and in part it was due to his administration's own incompetence, and in part is due to checks and balances. Um, but at the end of the day, Biden comes in and issues a bunch of executive orders that undoes the vast majority of whatever Trump's legacy was. The only major piece of legislation that got passed was the tax bill, which did some good things, but as I've noted before, it did not actually cut taxes because the spending burden rose. So, in terms of the expected future tax burden, we're actually paying more taxes than we were 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's what would be happening. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So,
Uh, uh, we had as a crazy anecdote, Kat and I moved trucks around. And
mhm.
one time we inadvertently were helping build the wall because we delivered a truck to the little road that was going along the wall in southern Arizona. We we were
Oh,
supposed to
wow.
deliver at this town, and they said, "Oh no, now follow us down this road." So that we actually
Interesting.
delivered the truck so it could help build the road next to the silly new wall they're building. And
Right.
it's comical every time you go and see the actual wall and thinking they're building a wall out here in the desert. This is craziness.
Yeah.
And when they have $1 million bombs and all this kind of stuff, and you're building this crazy wall in parts of the desert, it's very strange. Uh, the other thing that happened to us when Trump got in is we move RVs and stuff like that, and some of the parts weren't coming from China. It
Mhm.
just stopped happening. So some businesses were having trouble just even building things. It was very strange. So it's
Yeah.
been a strange mixed bag, and then we'll see what happens under the next group. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. Hopefully
uh,
not much.
well, that would be the best, wouldn't it?
Right.
That we didn't really notice much. Uh,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts overall right now with secession in the world? And are you optimistic, or do you think things are moving forward, or what?
It's a mixed bag. You know, the case of Catalonia is certainly a cautionary tale because there you have a Spanish government that did decide to suppress secession by force and imprisoned a bunch of politicians, and didn't really get punished for it. You know,
Hmm.
the rest of Europe basically said, "Well, this is a matter for Spain, an internal matter for Spain." And you could tell that they were uncomfortable with it by the fact that all these courts refused to extradite politicians who managed to escape to places like Belgium. Um, and and so Spain didn't have a lot of active support, but the
Hmm.
European Union is a club of governments, and you know they don't want to rock the boat. And so I think we saw from that example that governments can get away with um, you know, using quite a lot of force to just to stop an independence attempt, and you know, not really suffer any serious repercussions. Now, I think what's going to happen in Catalonia is that now you have this hardcore of about 40 to 45% of voters who are dead set on independence, who've been radicalized, and some of them even still, you know, talk about the republic. You know, we've created the republic, and and so they have this sort of alternative reality in which the republic exists and is the legitimate government, but is not being allowed
Okay.
to take power. And you
Well,
know, and that's
I'll,
kind of
I'll,
a
prob-
fantasy
I'll
world.
I'll probably hit that level in a year or two.
Okay, all right,
you you'll be going, okay, Russell's in phase two. He's
right,
lost it. He's gone to phase two. He's living in a fantasy world of the New Hampshire Republic.
right.
Yeah. I was definitely thinking that that would go better. Yeah, so that was a disappointment.
Yeah,
Like, uh,
I didn't think Spain would go to those lengths, but they did, and
yeah.
yeah. So it's well, and the other thing is, I think the Catalans could have done more to resist, but I think they were worried about, you know, they had to cater to perceptions internationally, and had they used anything that looked like violence or sabotage, it might have hurt their cause, um, and and so they were in a bind, right? They could not do the only things that might have been effective enough to prevent Spain from taking control again. So, so I think Spain is sort of a roadmap for other central governments around the world that want to crush these things, um, and so that's not good. I'd like
Mhm.
to see Spain pay some kind of price for that, so that governments say, you know what, maybe we should go down the road of negotiation instead.
Yeah, and somehow supporting the other guys. Um, do you think it would ever be right to use violence in a independence movement?
Yeah, I think it can be. I mean, I think violence is only acceptable in defense of self or others, and even then, it has to be proportional. So. It will very rarely be justified. Of course, the United States seceded from Great Britain by use of force. So if you know if you think violence is never acceptable in a secession attempt, then you think the American Revolution was unjustified. And that's a conversation we can have whether it was justified or not. I happen to think it was. Um, so I think that's a case where, as a last resort, um, you know, given that the other options had failed, and given the great long-term gains and goods that you could achieve by nevertheless going ahead and trying to secede, I think that that was worth doing in that case. We have to remember that the governments are organized violence, so allowing um, you know, not seceding is in a sense also licensing violence because you're allowing the existing government to use violence. So, you know, these are difficult considerations where we have to exercise good judgment.
Yeah, like for me, if I'm thinking I'm not wanting to cooperate with the violence that's already happening, yeah, that starts taking you to radical areas. What do you think? Do you think the Catalans could have done anything, or what would you have thought would have been better steps to take?
Yeah. Well, I think there was a point at which it became clear that there was not going to be a decisive majority for independence.
Okay, yeah,
Um, and I think because what happened is that the people who are opposed to independence boycotted the referendum. The people who are in favor of independence turned out,
hmm,
and not quite 50% of the voters turned out to vote. So,
yeah,
and of course, of those who voted, something like 95% voted to secede. So it's and all the polls were really closely divided. Sometimes it'd be one way, majority in favor of independence, sometimes it'd be the other. And I think under those circumstances, I think you take a step back and you say the time is not yet right. And
hmm,
you know, the problem is they had set out this roadmap, and so they had boxed themselves in. They had to follow through on that roadmap, or
yeah,
they would lose their own supporters.
yeah.
They would be breaking a promise in a sense.
Yeah,
And
they're not just taking little tiny steps and trying to push the population in one direction. They were having specific political, yeah, things they were planning. Yeah.
and I think the moment when they could have done that is actually after the elections. They called them plebiscitary elections because they had Spain had rejected a binding referendum, or any referendum
Yeah.
actually, and um, and so the Catalan government decided to hold an election, and it said if we win this election, it will be a mandate to pursue our roadmap, and we will hold an unauthorized referendum, and if that succeeds by a majority, then we will declare independence, right? And they set forth this roadmap. Well, in that election, pro-independence parties won a majority of seats, but not a majority of votes. Um, and it's complicated by the fact that one of the parties was neutral on independence, right? So maybe
Mm.
if you split that party down the middle, then you get a majority of votes in favor of independence. But I think that would have been the moment when voices in the party could have said, well, there are a couple of parties that actually had to form a coalition government. I think voices in that movement could have said, mm, this is not. Yes, we won the election in terms of seats and we can govern, but we don't have the level of support that we thought we would need to proceed with the roadmap as written, and that would have been a blow to them. They would have alienated some supporters, and some of them would have left to form other political parties and things like that. Um, but I think it would have allowed the independence movement to sort of bide its time a little bit. Yeah, maybe it splinters, but um, maybe the support for the movement as a whole grows over time relative to what actually happened, where people got very polarized, and now it's kind of almost a frozen conflict, where half are vehemently pro-independence and half are vehemently anti-independence.
Yeah. Uh, so what advice do you have for us NHExit people?
Well, I think um, you know I, in the given where the conversation is in the United States right now, I think a lot of the conversations you can have need not be about independence or secession in those terms. I think you can
Mhm.
talk about self-government or autonomy, decentralization, and use those as concepts to rally people around, with the idea that in the long run, as you, I'm sorry, let me let me repeat that so you can edit it out.
Oh, it
um,
wasn't that loud, so
okay, my microphone fell. Uh, so you can have conversations around those concepts of autonomy and self-government, with the idea that, of course, the more autonomy you get, ultimately it approximates independence. And I'm not sure New Hampshire needs its own army, um, or its own embassies abroad or things like that. I think it would be good if New Hampshire controlled all of its own economic policies and all of its own criminal justice policies. And if things like COVID response had been a state responsibility, and New Hampshire had bought its own vaccines instead of having to wait on an incompetent federal government for them, I think that would have been good.
Yeah.
So I think you can take back power in all those areas that matter, um, and rally people around that. And you don't even have to use the phrase independence. Now, some people will, like some people are kind of will want to be that vanguard. Like, I want to open people's minds. I want to
Mm,
get them to think. Um, and there's a place for that, but there's also a place, I think, um, for gradualism and building a broader coalition.
mhm. Well, I always picture myself, and I kind of picture NHExit always being that most extreme position,
Yeah,
right? And that way we're kind of always pushing this that this would be the ultimate thing to be, like you were saying at the beginning, if you have your own sovereignty, that's kind of the ultimate step. But yeah, there'd be so many steps leading to that that would all be better.
yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's a place for that. Again, I think people need to at least take that concept seriously. They need to take secession seriously as an option, because if you don't have access to that option, how are you going to lever the federal government into negotiating over the other stuff? So it needs to be there as a last resort, and educating people on that is worthwhile.
Yeah, and it seems like with us, we can be talking to people that are pro secession, anti, and like you're talking about, maybe different steps should be taken. And then also, all of this can also help people think of it in terms of we're not trying to start a war and enslave black people. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
none of us have any of those ideas. The purpose of it, like you're saying, it's not like you're dying to have our own army. That's not what
yeah.
we're hoping for. Maybe we can just pay for less of other people's armies.
That's
maybe we,
right.
maybe we can cut down that part. Maybe I don't have to pay taxes that pay for people to be in Afghanistan, because that's not
Right.
what I want to do. So, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, the
Okay.
more we can make it a forward-looking 21st century concept, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, this covered everything I could have wanted to, but there's so much more we can talk about. Maybe we can do it again another time. And uh, I will point people to a couple of the things that you have out there so that they can find the rest of your stuff, I think. And because you'll find lots of interesting studies that Jason has done in the past and papers that are along these lines and stuff like that. So this has worked out great. Thanks for coming, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Russell. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye.
Bye.